cultural advocate, Tomás Ybarra-Frausto has been a leading scholar and theorist in the field of Chicano studies. He has written extensively on the subject and has been instrumental in defining the canons of Chicano art and has influenced several generations of scholars, even to the present. His publications point back to his foundational essay, Rascachismo, later reprinted in the 1991 exhibition catalog Chicano Art, Resistance and Reformation, and retitled Rascachismo and Chicano Sensibility. It points as well to a comprehensive bibliography of Chicano art, 1965 to 1981, which he co-authored with Schiffer Goldman, and to the more recent volume that Mari Carmen Ramirez mentioned yesterday, that she edited with Hector Olea and with Tomás in 2012, Resisting Categories, Latin American and or Latino with a question mark. For many years, Tomás served as the Associate Director for Creativity and Culture at the Rockefeller Foundation, where he stewarded the Humanities Residency Fellowship Program, Museum Program, and the U.S.-Mexico Fund for Culture, as well as La Red Latinoamericana de Productores Culturales. Prior to his work at the Foundation, Tomás was a professor at Stanford University in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He has served as chair of the board of the Mexican Museum in San Francisco and chair of the Smithsonian Council. In 1999, he was awarded the Henry Medal by the Smithsonian Institution, and in 2017, he was awarded by the Archives of American Art the Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for scholarly excellence in the field of American art history, which we'll be discussing in a minute. Please give a warm welcome to Tomás Ybarra-Frausto. So we're joined as well by Josh Franco, who is a scholar, writer, and the National Collector of the Archives of American Art, where he works to identify, investigate, and acquire personal papers, institutional records, and other primary sources that tell the stories of American art. Franco served as Latino Collection Specialist at the Archives of American Art from 2015 to 2017, and he has presented his scholarly and critical work at Stanford University, Dartmouth College, the Frick Collection, among others, and has exhibited his own artwork at venues that include CoLab in Austin, Society for the Study of Gloria Anzaldúa, San Antonio in Austin, DePauw University, and the Elsewhere Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. A native of West Texas, Franco received his doctorate from Binghamton University, SUNY, with a dissertation entitled Marfa, Minimalism, Rascachismo, and Questioning Decolonial Aesthetics in Far West Texas. This will be relevant to the discussion. It's a pleasure to welcome Josh Franco. Now, although unable to join us today, artist and cultural critic Amalia Mesa Baines is very much present among us today. Throughout her cross-disciplinary career, she has worked to define a Chicano and Latinx aesthetic in the US and Latin America. She has pioneered the documentation and interpretation of Chicano traditions in Mexican American art through her theoretical writings, cultural activism, and through her own altar installations. Her book, Homegrown Engaged Cultural Criticism with Bell Hooks, is a dialogue that explores the intersections of Chicano and Black studies. A recipient of a distinguished MacArthur Fellowship, she founded and developed the Visual and Public Art program at California State University at Monterey Bay and is currently Professor Emerita at the university. Amalia Mesa Baines has sent us some remarks that serve to frame the proceedings in the next 2 days. She writes, "Dear friends and colleagues, I regret I cannot be with you today, but as some of you know, my beloved sister, Judith Angela Mesa, passed away unexpectedly recently, and this loss has taken its toll on my health. Consequently, I had to forego my trip to Houston. I'm especially regretful because I will miss the chance to see all of you and to hear your presentations, and most importantly, I will miss sharing the discussion with my colleague, Dr. Roberto Tejana, and my lifelong friend and fellow scholar, the esteemed Dr. Tomás Ybarra-Frausto. The land gathering grows more important in this dark time because I believe our models of solidarity, collegiality, and activism as artists, scholars, and creatives is critical to confronting the onslaught against our diverse communities. The racist, anti-immigrant, sexist, and homophobic slurs aimed at our people can only be mitigated by the truth of all our historic contributions to the nation, our beautiful diversity, and our creative resilience. I know the work in the days ahead will manifest these powerful antidotes to the prevailing cruelties we experience daily. In my own life, she continues, I've had the honor to work with Tomás Ybarra-Frausto for over 40 years, and our shared amistad and history has been one of these guiding forces. From dinner parties to building altares together and confronting misinterpretations in the museum world, we have continued a dialogue of intellect, spirit, and art. I know that he and Roberto and Josh Franco will continue this tradition, as will all of you in the rich events unfolding at LAN. So for the arc of the next hour, it's going to involve some visual material that Josh Franco very generously has harvested and gathered from Tomás's archive at the Archives of American Art. And it will guide our discussion with Tomás that begins with his association with Amalia Mesa Baines and the network of intellectual engagement. And then it'll also discuss the history in this very interesting and problematic sometimes history between the relationship of Mexican art and Chicano art. And then we'll move to the very important exhibition at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston that was mentioned yesterday, Hispanic Art in the United States. And all of this is to say, a sort of setup that the foundational work and collaboration between Tomás and Amalia has really paved the pathway for our own and current understandings of Latinx art, of Latinx identities, and the intersectionalities that they can activate. So with that said, I will turn the microphone to Josh, who will begin to lead us through some of the images that we'll be looking at, and we'll be asking Tomás to sort of respond to this archive and the stories that it is able to tell.
Thanks, Roberto. Can you hear me? Great. So I would also rather than Amalia be here with me. If you're thinking that, I agree. But I'm very happy to be here to kind of fill the spot. I'm very happy to share these documents. So I just want to give a few brief remarks about the history of the archives and the process of acquiring Tomás's papers there and their significance, and then we'll get started digging into those documents that I harvested, but also Roberto came on a last-minute trip to DC and spent a good 2 hours also harvesting them with me. It was a fun day, fun, unexpected morning. So the Archives of American Art is the largest repository in the world that gathers the sources needed to study the development of American art. So that means we have over 6,000 collections of individual artist papers and institutional records. These include things like correspondence, photographs, sketchbooks, preparatory materials, a lot of printed ephemera that researchers use on a daily basis and around the world through our very robust digitizing program and our website. In 2017, the Archives of American Art was very honored that Tomás accepted our Lawrence A. Fleischman Award for Scholarly Excellence in the field of American art history. This award goes to scholars who not only add to the field, but fundamentally shift what the field of American art is. What is understood globally to be American art by often, in the case of Tomás, doing very grassroots work over a long, sustained amount of time with peers to create that shift. And so what am I talking about? Which is for me.
Can we get the clicker to work?
Should we just hit the button?
That's not connected to it.
Oh. So I just want to show two quick examples of how Tomás's work has shifted the field. So Rasmachismo. This is a catalog from the 1989 exhibition that was called Rasmachismo that brought Tomás's essay and other essays gathered in the catalog to explain what was happening in the artwork and why it was gathered, and the history of Rasmachismo as a popular term, a Spanish word in literature and in common parlance as well. my grandma describes rascachismo as one time when she was a little girl, her friend invited her to get ice cream, and then after they ordered, she said, "I don't have any money, you have to pay." So that's Tomás's talent, is to bring things that are already embedded in our culture into the larger academic national platform, so that they can be used and deployed to understand American art more broadly beyond our community as well. So I work with Tomás's papers as a very serious anchor. I work to bring in other materials where rascachismo is demonstrated, so that eventually, and I think we're getting closer every decade, rascachismo is another American artism, along with minimalism, conceptualism, abstract expressionism. I think that's the goal, so that rascachismo is as common to not just our Latinx art peers, but all of our art peers when we discuss what goes on in this country among its artists. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm just clicking it wrong. And then these two documents, this is, first of all, just a kind of object lesson in archival materials. You see here the transition from a handwritten text to a typescript of an essay on its way to publication, which is very valuable for researchers. This particular document, the title here is An Affecting Presence, Chicano Altars and Altar Makers. And I'm showing this. This is another fundamental shift that Tomás's and Amalia's as well scholarship has created in American art. The introduction of altars as a sculptural form, as a spiritual practice that has entered museums, but of course still lives in my grandparents' yards and some of our homes as well. So introducing altars as a serious American art form has fundamentally shifted how we understand definitions of sculpture, environmental production, and again, in a way that once it's in the archives of American art, in the broad context there, shifts all of American art history, not just Latinx art history.
Maybe I'll just read a brief, it's so brief in Tomás's handwriting. A basic goal of the Chicano arts movement has been to create un nuevo arte del pueblo, a new art of the people, created within the consciousness of a shared historical experience and based on vernacular art traditions. Necessarily a first step has been the investigation, validation, and presentation of authentic expressive forms arising from the richly diverse Chicano community. And then he makes the distinction between the ways in which the dominant culture has included rigid distinctions between fine and folk art. And the Chicano art movement has attempted to eradicate those boundaries and integrate categories.
Yeah, thank you. Next slide, please. Then one more little bit for me before we get into what we're all here for. So out of the 6,000 collections, the Tomás Ybarra-Frausto research material on Chicano art are the 5th most requested collection out of 6,000. Take that in. That shows the demand for this research material across the globe. That takes into account online requests as well. So take that statistic out and tell everyone, please. I think it's so significant. And as I was researching for this, I was looking again at the finding aid for these papers. The finding aid being sort of the table of contents for the collection. It's where a researcher starts to understand what's in each box, what's in groups of folders. And there's something very unusual about your finding aid, Tomás, in that the biographical note is written by you. Typically, the biographical note in that document is written by an archivist, sometimes with the curatorial team as well. Very standard, gives you kind of the basic lifeline of the person as an introduction to the records. But this is an autobiographical one and very exceptional in that way, and I think it's quite worth reading out loud, so I want to read that, and then I think we'll get started. So this is written in 1998. Papelitos, little bits of paper, whether rent receipts, paid bills, or piles of personal letters, can become layered bundles of personal history. I have always been a pepenador, a scavenger, and saver of paper scraps. Diary notes, scribbled annotations, and first drafts are often useful indicators of ideas in gestation. Papelitos are the fragments of everyday life that gain expanded meaning integrated into larger historical events of a period. In the decade of the 1960s, I started saving ephemeral material, exhibition announcements, clippings of individual artists, and of organizations fomenting the Chicano art movement. The social scenarios of the period, such as marches, strikes, sit-ins, and mobilizations for social justice, all spawned manifestos, posters, leaflets, and other forms of printed material. I somehow managed to assemble and protect the evanescent printed information that recorded the birth and development of Chicano art. As I started to research and write about Chicano art and artists of the period, I continued to clip, photocopy, and preserve material given me by Mexican-American artists from throughout the nation. My idea was to form an archive that would be comprehensive rather than selective. I knew that it was the offbeat, singular piece of paper with a missing link of information that would attract the scholar. Today, several decades after the flowering of Chicano art, there is still a lamentable paucity of research and information about this significant component of American art. It is my fervent hope that this compendium of information will function as a resonant print and image bank for investigators of Chicano culture. Perhaps contained within the archive are the facts that will inspire new visions or revisions of Chicano art and culture. This is my fondest dream. I think the dream's coming true. I'm so happy to be a part of it from us. So as Roberto said, from here we'll go through some documents. This is kind of a this is your life in papers scenario. I think it'll be very fun. I think Roberto will interject and we'll have a nice conversation. Yes, we want Amalia's presence here very much so. So what we're looking at here are a handwritten note, I assume from a sit-down at some point. I'm sure there's been thousands of sit-downs between you and Amalia over the years, where Tomás writes the brief notes, Amalia, 1940, and I put a question mark because I couldn't read the number. Sunnyvale, California. Theo Luis is a wood carver, and the family has a penchant for invention. And also is a catalog from the Ofrendas exhibition Amalia organized. But Tomás, I think the first question I would love to hear, I think everyone would know, is can you tell us when you met Amalia and what that was like and what brought you together in the first place?
Funny, I don't remember.
That's a good friendship sign.
I really don't remember when I met Amalia. It might have been at the conference on Chicano art, one of the first conferences in Santa Clara, California. So I really don't remember the date, but it seems like forever. And she is really very present in my mind today. She's contributed so much, and her work, I think, she actually started, it's very difficult for an artist, I think, to create a new genre. And I think the genre of altar installations, which is what she has been working on and contributed, is really a significant genre, a new genre in American art. And I think that for us, I was reading the wonderful new catalog, the show that I hope all of us can go to see, that I'm very excited about seeing, the Axis Mundo catalog, in which it talks about archives and particularly LGBT plus archives. And so the thing that it struck me, it said, you know, the real basis for an archive is chisme. that chisme is the never-ending archive. And in many ways, it's that idea of performative kind of speaking with friends, meeting with friends, that all of us have shared over the years, is I really think the archive to be. And the archive to be, I think, is still, even though Josh and a lot of other archives in the country are significant, there's still much more to recover from our communities, particularly the tangible and intangible heritage of our communities, the kind of knowledge systems that are embedded, and particularly I want to speak about my generation, the elders of the community, those of us that are in our 70s and our 80s, our community is very, very young. The future for the Latinx generation is really, really wonderful and open and significant. But I think also the elders, my generation, still have a lot of knowledge systems that we can learn from in terms of artistic creation, particularly in terms of the community and the kind of values that are embedded in our culture, particularly at the moment. I'll tell you a story about my mother before she died, when I used to be in New York and would come to San Antonio. And we used to go to panaderias to buy pan dulce, sweet bread, Mexican sweet bread. And one day we went to a panaderia and I said to the lady who was serving us, señorita, deme $5 de pan surtido. Give me $5 of bread and mix it up. And when we came out, my mother arched her eyebrow and she said, hijo, ¿te has olvidado los nombres de los panes? Have you forgotten the names of the sweet breads? Una oreja no es lo mismo que un marranito, y un marranito no es lo mismo que un chamuco, y un chamuco no es lo mismo que un pan de huevo. She said, cada pan tiene su nombre, su identidad, su presencia, su sabor. And then she looked at me and she said, ay, hijo, yo creo que cuando se olvidan los nombres de los panes, se olvida la cultura. Now, many years later, I understand what my mother was trying to tell me, that the nombres de los panes, the intangible heritage of our community, it's the tangible heritage that's taught at the universities and in books and the songs we sing that are archived, the music, the literature that is taught in Latino and Chicano studies and courses. All of that is a tangible heritage. But the intangible heritage, the process of doing things, the value systems of our community are still to be archived. And that can be only archived in the kind of conversations that we're going to have this morning about how we used to get together, how we have to get together, how these conferences are important, all the things that are shared, the remembrances of how things were. And this intangible heritage, I think, as the African proverb puts it, when an elder dies, a whole library vanishes. And I'm very concerned about that library that is quickly vanishing, that is still held in the memories and values of the everyday vernacular experience. Because remember, even all of us, all the dichos, all the ways they're more than what they say. They mean more than what they say. For example, one dicho that I just was remembering is, uno trabaja para vivir, no vive para trabajar. One lives in order one works in order to live. One doesn't live in order to work. That life is more than working. And this is very important in a consumer society, in a society that values the dollar over the experiences of people. And so I'm just sort of saying that Amalia and I, that one of the really deep structures of feeling and sentimiento that she has is this ability to transform the everyday practices, particularly the feminist practices. And embedded in there are really important issues. For example, the whole issue of gender and power, in the altares, because the women, the domestic altares are a way, they're not the official hierarchical Catholic altares, that are very, in a way, relate to the power dynamics of the Catholic Church, where the priests are all male. And so this is a way that women have found a way by building their own particular thing and their own spirituality based on the popular notion and the ideas that have been transmitted, that in some ways it has another way of dealing with power relations, in this case with the Catholic Church, at a very personal and private, familiar level. And so that's why I think that her work in the altares is more than just, and the process of making the altares is part of this intangible heritage. It's the process itself that is the idiom, not the finished project. And also, as we all know, it's a sort of an anti-commodification system or project, because it's very difficult when you have an installation to sell it. As a matter of fact, that's one conversation we've had. She said, Tomás, I've never made a penny on my altares because who buys a whole room full of stuff, and so now of course there are galleries and institutions that are buying altares, but it was a very important step in saying, art is not really a thing of commodification. It's for other purposes. And one of the really basic things throughout her, altares, I'll just mention in my mind the three stages. At the beginning, she started making altares that were related to Catholic iconography and popular religious practices, but she inserted always a kind of larger Latino influx. For example, her use of drapery in a lot of her first altares, for example, a very famous altar that's now at the Smithsonian, the Altar de Dolores del Rio, has, it's a vanity, a woman's vanity with a lot of drapery on it. But the drapery really came, she told me, from her studies of Caribbean Santeria, because the tronos, which are the equivalent of altares in Caribbean and Cuban Santeria, use a lot of textiles and a lot of ornamentation, very similar to what she was doing. So incorporating in her very first altares was a pan-Latino kind of sensibility, where she used elements from her mestizo background. She herself, of course, she said, Tomás, my grandmother was black, and I didn't realize this until much later. She was just a Mexicana. She was a curandera. And so from her own lived experience, she is a mestiza artist. She has indigenous, and she has African, and of course she has the U.S. experience, and all of those are wedded into her first altar making. Then the second phase of her altares was when she took this domestic, private, women's art making process and developed it into installations. They were desacralized, and they now got into the white cube of the museum. And then the third phase is where now I think she's really coming to another very significant. The first two altares were sort of mestizaje combinations. The third phase is where she is really dealing now in a global sense with all the kind of still traditions that we all share. And these are the global traditions from the very beginning, from the conquest, from colonization. And she's now making many altares based on the European Wunderkammer, the Chamber of Curiosities. And because in the Wunderkammer, the Chamber of Curiosities, as you know, are all these sort of like 17th century chambers where the Europeans took a lot of material from the Americas and preserved them and maintained them, but recontextualized them in a form that was not the original form. So she's bringing back in her Wunderkammers the European, she's bringing back the objects that were stolen during that period back to the Americas and repositioning them. And so this third phase is a really larger global analysis of how objects travel through time and meaning, and underneath it all is this really idea of resonance and wonder. How all these objects have this wonderful feeling of a particular, it wasn't a question of a confluence of the old world and a new world, because of course here was a very ancient world. So it was two old worlds meeting. And so she's dealing with that. And so I'm right now working on a chapter on the Wunderkammer and on her. That is now working in a sort of global context. This is getting a long way from the conversation, so I'll stop here.
If we go to the next slide, you can continue that actually great conversation.
Could we have the next slide, please? Because this clicker's not working actually.
So this is some documentation related to the exhibition Ceremony of Spirit that Amalia involved. And I would love to hear your experience. Something that stands out to me about Ceremony of Memory has always stood out, is that it's around altar building and spiritual practice in an art context. But it is incredibly pan-Latinx. You know, it was Primer Cardillo from Uruguay, Angel Suarez Rosado, Puerto Rican, New Yorker. Probably, if you were in that exhibition, please speak up in the Q&A. But I would, it seems like while it's a very ephemeral form, it's a very durable practice, and also a very one that seems to be, there's been such hard lines in the past, sometimes, I don't feel that in this space, but between different Latinx communities. But altar and spiritual practices, especially the way Amalia and you approached them and created spaces for them, seem to open that up. So I'd love to hear how that experience was communicating over altars and spiritual practices as art between different Latino communities.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank three of the younger scholars that have really opened up the work on Amalia. That's Cani Cortez and Jennifer Gonzalez and Laura Perez. Their books focus on spirituality, and as women, feminists themselves, they have really helped me understand, the gender dynamics and the particularly the pre-Columbian basis for a lot of the spiritual practices that are still held in the communities. So the question was, yes, again, yesterday, this is an ongoing conversation. Many of these ideas, Mari Carmen yesterday mentioned many of these ideas embedded in what she was talking about. As we travel, as she traveled, she would be one of those that Mari Carmen yesterday labeled a cultural broker. She has used the Caribbean experience of the different forms of popular religiosity, whether it's candomblé or santeria, in incorporated elements of that, actually by using objects from those cultures in her altares. And so it's not only the Catholic, symbology and material, but also, those that come from the different African-derived and also, and she did it because she met practitioners of these practices that are still very much alive in our communities. And one of the people, again, that was very influential in her work was the director of the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York, Marta Moreno Vega, and who is all Santeria priestess. So a lot of her work has come from other women that have used religiosity as a way of, I would call it sort of like a militant religiosity, a religiosity that has to do not only with religion, but also with an actual way of dealing with social problematics. And, whether we call her a Tlamantini or, a pre-Columbian, as Laura does so well in her book, or insert her the way Jennifer does in the larger intellectual context of the notion of installations and the tradition of installations, all the way from, and this is another point. I think that one of the things that is really part of the archive to be is the inclusion of the American part, the Euro-American part. As the Latinx generation is saying so bravely and so wonderfully, Latinx art is American art. American art is Latinx art. By American, they mean U.S., the U.S., the United States. As we all know, Latino art is not Latin American art. There's affinities, there's connections, but it's something that is, homegrown. And most of our artists went to school in universities that were going through all of the artists of my generation, let's say of the 20th century. We started going, actually the Chicano movement, I think, didn't start in 1965 with Cesar Chavez and the Civil Rights Movement, but with the Second World War, when the first GIs came, and under the GI Bill, they started going to universities, and we have our first artists that are university trained. And from that moment on, the university, and they were learning whatever isms and was being taught to them. So we've forgotten, or most of us, and there's another field that's really open, is to reinsert us into the Euro-American, experience, and how we've negotiated, the Euro-American experience and the Latino experience. So I think that's another really important part that Amalia has worked through.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Can we do it? Oh, yeah. So I think, and this is, I just want to read from this document that we're looking at here, a brief quote. This is Tomás writing about Amalia. Process, difference between performance and text. The text is the idea for the altars, with all the constituent elements in motion for the placement. The day of arrangement is like a rehearsal, but the altar is like a performance in that it interacts with the viewer. And this led me to reflect on how Amalia's work and other altaristas have literally changed how we behave in museums. And just another kind of vector to throw in as you think about unpacking this is, I thought a lot about Marfa in the backyard of my grandfather's home where La Guadalupe appeared in the 90s. There's, like good Mexicans, there's an altar, a statue of her now in that spot. And it's next door to Donald Judd's outdoor sculptures, which are giant cement blocks. And people come to the altar and make offerings, as you do, little tobaccos or plantitas, whatever. And I always wonder if we switched how we behaved in Marfa and we left offerings like jet sculptures and began having this kind of museum reference for this object. We gave it conservation care in the budget, for instance. That's a thought experiment I have, but it's the thought experiment that Amalia's work introduced to the museum space, the buildings, and the audiences. So I would love to hear more about how you see that legacy of how her work has changed how we inhabit museum spaces, very physically.
Well, as a part of, she started making altars in California at the time of what was then called new genre art, right? This was a moment when Kinholz was doing his installations, when Chase Oldenburg was doing that store that he was selling, there were paper mache installations. This is a point when the object came off the wall and into the space of the viewer himself or herself. This was a transition. And so altars are like three-dimensional collages. And this was the moment when we transitioned from sort of like modernity to so-called post-modernity. And we always used to joke about Guillermo Gómez Peña, who said, you know, oh, we Chicanos have always been postmodernists. We're involuntary postmodernists because we do everything in a bricolage mode, you know, and that comes from the notion of scarcity. You make do with what you have. You recycle materials. You integrate materials. If you don't have enough of something, you add something else that you have. So it's not all of a kind. And what the altares did also, as they come off the wall, the art, she did away with this notion of art as this privileged, don't touch kind of thing. She actually has, she wrote, I mean, she did a lot of her artwork that was put in like artist books and materials on tables, so that you actually participated in the making of the altar, this performative sense, where you yourself were part of this process of altar making. So bringing the object off the wall into the space of the viewer, and then the viewer actually being allowed to touch things. And she did something sort of wonderful. In many of her altars, there's like, for example, the Art of Dolores del Rio, she wrote, she imagines, a lot of altars have this, her own personal imagination. And she imagined that Dolores del Rio, when she was in Hollywood and was a big Hollywood star, that she was, you know, the tale is that she was involved with Tyrone Power, two, you know, significant American Hollywood actors. And so she wrote all these letters to Dolores from Tyrone Power, and then she crumpled them up, and they're thrown in the base of the altar. And so once in a while, a viewer will pick them up and, you know, and read them. And so he participates actually in what she was trying to do about this sort of wonderful beauty and the presentation of herself. That's another part that, well, let's go on and on. But fashion is really a really significant part of her work. She herself, as we all know, is this sort of icon. She presents herself in this fashionable way. She's very, very much interested in fashion. She did an altar that's a very significant altar called the Latina World's Fair, in which she uses women that she thinks have been very significant as women, as fighters, as, you know, and these women are like Maria Felix, Ana Mendieta, Dolores del Rio, you know, women who in their own struggle as women and as artists contributed. And she made, in 1943, right after 1945, right after the Second World War ended in France, the couturier houses, you know, didn't have material because all the materials were given to the war effort. And so all the couturiers, Dior, Balenciaga, Madame Grès, all the couturiers made little dolls, and they made a little costume for the dolls. And then they sent them away. It was called the Teatro de la Mode. And they traveled all over Europe. Well, she took that idea and she made a Teatro de la Moda with all these Latina women and their little dresses, and she made all the dresses in the installation. And then she used other parts, and she made this Latino World's Fair, which is one of her installations. But I'm just making the point that fashion is also it's also part of that intangible kind of heritage that she is trying to articulate in a tangible way.
I mean, I would also say that the intellectual relationship you have has affected your thinking as an archivist as well. It seems to me that at the bottom of what Josh read, it says ephemeral work, altars are time limited. After they are dismantled, they exist only in memory and documentation. And that seems to point back to the anecdote of your mother and the ways in which even gossip and anecdotes are part of the archive that you've been trying to collect as a gobernador.
Right.
So we have, let's go to the next slide.
And this is our final slide, specifically about Amalia. It's a fax. Fax paper is terrible conservation-wise, by the way. So I've already made a preservation copy of this. It's going to be okay. But this is when she was in her administrative role in Galeria de la Raza. And that's certainly, we've had a wonderful conversation about her as an artist, but her as a field builder and an administrator is crucial. So I would love to hear more about your experience with her in her role at Galeria. And then I'll read this quote, which touches on something you've already mentioned. And from this fax, women's work began to be exhibited in earnest by the mid-'80s. Especially important has been the first West Coast exhibits of Latino artists during our Marking Time, Marking Place and the 1992 Quincentenary series. Latina artists included Maria Brito, Jocelyn Carvalho, and Catalina Parra. And I'm just very curious too about what it meant, what it means to be a man working in solidarity to support women's work as well. If you want to speak to that. So Galeria de la Raza and being a man in a woman's world.
Well, I think my own status, as a gay man has been important in the sort of understanding the kind of discrimination and gender bias, that exists. But in terms of Amalia, as an administrator, she did when she was at the Galeria de la Raza, which is a fundamental institution that in her initial comments, she says how we're under stress right now. At this moment, a lot of our institutions are barely hanging on because of things like gentrification, where in all the big cities, and all our communities are being erased as, particularly in San Francisco with the .com generation that are coming in into the Latino community, into where the Galeria was, and the rents are so high that the Galeria and people can't exist and they have to find another place. And the artists all get displaced. And so this is, she, at the Galeria, one of her major contributions to the Galeria was to create what she called the Regeneration Project. And the Regeneration Project, which I think is a model for all of us to do wherever we are, she decided that her generation had done what they could and we're going to turn over the whole Galeria, all the administration, all the committees, all of them, and the elders were going to be like a resource community, but the Galeria wasn't going to be taken by it was called Regeneration, the new generation that included the Latinx generation, because in San Francisco, of course, as in many of our communities, it's a Latino community. It had people, it wasn't a Mexican-American community like the community that I was born in, San Antonio, where I live now. It's actually a pan-Latino community. And so she decided that this pan-Latino generation had other ideas about exhibition practices, about which artists they felt were expressing their negotiations of identity, of which ways this new generation was pushing forward the ideas. And so she the board literally turned everything over to the new generation. And Amalia is very much the forefront of really working with the regeneration, this process of changing over and turning over, literally not only just making a space at the table, but turning over the table to the new generation, which I think is a wonderful idea that many of us should follow.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to our next topic, Mexico. I think Roberto wants to say some introductory things.
And it's cool. Tomás shared an anecdote with me yesterday, which might be relevant to making a shift into what, in the next 15 minutes, we can talk about this relationship between Mexican art and Chicano art in those early formations from the 1980s. And maybe, Tomás, you might talk about your being with Amalia in Mexico City and how you met a photographer there.
Oh, Yes, this is a story, just an anecdote. But I think, in the terms of chisme and the anecdote and telling stories, that Amalia and I were visiting the Frida Kahlo, which is another really interesting point, because as you know, when Hayden Herrera, you know how we think all these things come into your head. When we think of Hayden Herrera and her book on Frida Kahlo, which many take as the initial Frida Kahlo, the beginning of Fridomania, no, it was actually the Chicana artist in California, in San Francisco, who actually, Amalia made one of her first altars is an altar to Frida Kahlo, much before Hayden Herrera had published her biography of Frida Kahlo. And also, Rupert Garcia did a wonderful bibliography of almost everything that had been written about Frida Kahlo. And so, and Dorinda Moreno, who had a newspaper called Mestiza something in San Francisco, Frida Kahlo was on the masthead, her face. So Frida Kahlo was introduced to American art by the Latina artists in California, way before the Fridomania and the exhibition of Frida at the Carrillo Hill Museum in Mexico. And so that was another thing, just an aside. But the anecdote that I told you yesterday, I think, was the one about Graciela Iturbide, the Mexican photographer. Amalia and I were visiting, she was doing more research on Frida, and we were visiting La Casa Azul in Mexico City, in Coyoacán. And she said, Tomás, let's play a game. And I said, okay. She said, remember all the photographs, the wonderful photographs of Frida? I'm going to pose as Frida, and all these photographs are embedded in my mind, and you take my picture. And I said, okay. So, of course, I didn't have a camera. So she would pose. Remember that famous Frida pose where she's with a big bubble, red bubble, and she's standing there, and so she stood there and click, and took a picture. And we went downstairs, and that famous picture where she is in the garden with the squinkles, the dogs, and she stood like Frida, she posed like Frida, and I went click, and we were taking pictures and laughing, and then we went to the cafe to have a drink, and this woman came by, and she said, I've been seeing you play this game, and I'm a photographer, and my name is Graciela Iturbide, and I live very near here, and I would love to have tea with you and talk about Frida. And so we did, and that's how we met Graciela Iturbide, one of the great, significant Mexican photographers. And so it's a way how stories, gossip, information is passed on, and that is still part of the archive.
She thought you were doing performance art.
Yes.
And you were?
And we were.
I think for time, we're going to bring all these together. I know the document that can do it. Bring it forward. So yeah, we're going to go into I just want to get in one last point before we open up. So this happened in 1987 in Houston, where we are. I chose these documents from this for that purpose. There's one specific moment, if we go forward a little more. One more. Here. So this in the 1987 conference held in Houston about Hispanic art at that time. This is where you had an encounter with Octavio Paz. And so perhaps we'd love to hear more about that, and maybe give a little brief, a brief on Paz's, definition of Chicanismo, and then tell us about that exchange in 1987 that happened here in Houston as well.
And just briefly, some of the images we were showing are exhibitions that were spearheaded by Chicano artists in San Francisco, by poets, for example, Francisco Alarcón and Bejarano and others that were depending on institutional support from the IMBA, the Fine Arts Institute in Mexico City, and they never came through. So in a way, this is an idea that we've been talking about with Tomás, of this kind of encuentro and desencuentro between Mexico and Chicano art as it was starting to happen in the 1980s, which leads to the Houston exhibition and Octavio Paz.
Okay, well, the Houston exhibition was significant. We always say when we're talking about something, y lo bueno, and then you say good about it. Y lo malo, what was bad about it. Well, the exhibition was significant it was called, remember, Hispanic Art in the United States, 30 Contemporary Painters and Sculptors. And Octavio Paz was the lead writer for the major catalog for the exhibition. And of course, as a young, irreverent Chicano, during the conversation during the day, I stood up and I said, Maestro, con mucho respeto, you're going to tell me, Maestro, mucho respeto. No estoy muy de acuerdo con sus observaciones, especialmente cuando habla de la comunidad chicana en Estados Unidos. As an elitist writer in his Laberinto de la Soledad, and even in this exhibition, I said, why did you pick Martin Ramirez as an example of the Chicanos artist? A schizophrenic, a person that was really a major artist, but an artist that was, ill and schizophrenic as a symbol, almost as if you're saying that we ourselves are going between cultures and don't have an identity and are not solid. And I really don't think that that's correct. And so he listened and said, well, I see your point, and then we discussed. But that evening, and this is the anecdote, that evening after, it was a wonderful, wonderful, Houston went all out like they're doing now. They treated everyone royally, and there was a big dinner at a private collector's home that has a great collection of Mexican art. And after postprandial wine and tequilitas and stuff, he's talked to me, and he was really moved by the way that the Chicano community, the Latino community in Houston had come to the museum, and how they were so proud of the artists that were there, their artists, their community, their ideas expressed in visual terms. He was very, very moved, and he spoke to me, and it was so prescient that I went home immediately and wrote it in my journal. And this is what I wrote, that what he said. Tomás, Octavio Paz telling me, yo siento que todos nuestros intentos de crear un sentido de convivencia entre los pueblos de Latinoamérica, los ideales de Bolívar, los de Martí, ya son utopías falladas en los pantanos de la historia. Latinoamérica, primero pienso, pero yo pienso que ustedes, los latinos dentro de los Estados Unidos, tienen el reto, la promesa de poder crear una cultura puente entre las Américas. Tomás, I sense that all of our attempts to create a sense of co-presence among Latin American societies, the ideas of Bolívar, of Martí, are all failed utopias in the morass of history. However, I think that you, the Latinos within the United States, have the challenge, the possibility of creating a bridge culture between the two Americas. So you could tell that he was very moved, and he felt in some ways that as the cycle turns, as time turns, not like in the Eurocentric way of linear time, but in the old pre-Columbian way of a circular time, where the snake is biting its tail, and time is immemorial, and time goes on. Hay más tiempo que vida, that in that space, we in the United States had that possibility that I think today and in the future, the Latinx generation is going to really create that bridge culture, that knowledge that we are we have to go, for whatever our own culture is, we have to go beyond our kith and kin and be cosmopolitan and share. I would say, before we go on, I would say 3 words that I always talk about, and that's confianza, conocimiento, and convivencia. In order to get along, in order to understand, I want to know so much about the new community that are arriving in the United States. You know, hay que tener conocimiento, hay que conocernos unos a los otros. We don't want to change anyone. You know, a Puerto Rican is never going to be a Chicano. A Chicano is never going to be a Colombiano. We want to affirm their Colombianismo or their Chicanismo, whatever culture they belong to. We want to affirm that. We want them to belong. We want to be cosmopolitan and work together. But we have to know one another. We have to learn the artists from Central America, from Latin America, from all the communities. Houston is a wonderful place to do that because your community is all of Latin America. So that's conocimiento. And confianza, you know, is a very loaded word in our language. Confianza is what you make with people when you've shared experiences over time. When you know they're standing by your back because you've shared this experience, you have confidence in them. And we have to have confidence in the other groups, that we are not our own group, that somehow we are all struggling for the 3 things I think that unite us. I don't think it's religion or language perhaps, but I think they're historical experiences. Whether you're a Colombiano or a Peruano or a Salvadoreño, we've all had the experience of immigration. We've all had the experience of racialization in the United States. And we've all had the experience of colonization. And those deep historical things are the things that we share. And as we get to know, we've shared them in particularized different ways. But as we share them, we then build conocimiento, confianza, which leads to convivencia, the wonderful word from Spain, when Spain was trying to have convivencia with the Moors and the Jews, which are also very much a part of our deep traditions. And I think that artists, particularly the Latinx generation, I really salute you because I think that you are going to go into those deep recesses of our memory and find ways to make those connections. And indeed, you are putting the accent in America, you know, and you are showing us that America is American art. Latino American art is American art. And so I really applaud, and I hope that, that those dreams, as Octavio Paz says, those dreams of conocimiento and bridges are still alive, and you are the ones that will be making that transition.
That's good. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has a question from the audience.